Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Adopter Experience, a guide to increasing adoptions. This is a presentation that we had originally given at Expo, but we have a lot of new information that we're sharing as well. So we have a lot to pack into the time that we're together. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our panelist introductions and then start the webinar. So I'm Stephanie Filer. I'm the Executive Director for Shelter Animals Count. And then we have April Huntsman, who is with Adopt-A-Pet, Courtney Suthoff with Hills Pet Nutrition, Amanda Foster with Human Animal Support Services, and Lindsay Hamrick with Humane World for Animals. All right, so we are going to start by taking a really high-level view at what's happening with the data at animal sheltering organizations across the country. Looking at our report that we had put together for 2024, we know that there are more than 13,000 organizations that we were able to model data after. Almost or over 4,000 of those were brick and mortar shelters, and over 9,000 of those were foster-based rescues. So there are actually closer to 14,000 animal sheltering organizations in the country. We had a few that we had to exclude because we just didn't have enough data for. But of all of those organizations, we saw 5.8 million cats and dogs enter shelters last year. But just 10% of all of those intakes were represented by only 30 shelters in the country. So out of 14,000 organizations, 30 shelters represent 10% of the intakes coming in the US. Here's how it breaks out by org distribution. So you can see the majority of organizations are bringing in fewer than 100 animals, 44.8%. Where you have all the way on the far right, the highest intake organizations are bringing in more than 15,000 animals each year. When we look at that compared to adoptions, we are seeing that increase a little bit on that less than 100, where 52% of organizations are adopting less than 100 animals every year. And when you go all the way over to the far right, you see that just 3 organizations in the country are adopting more than 15,000 animals a year, which ends up being a 0.02% of all of the adoptions, of all of the organizations are represented by those 3 organizations. They're all 3 in California, by the way. When we start to look at the data by capita, we actually added a few new dashboards to our website this year that look at state-specific information. And you can see the highest adoptions per capita, the highest of all, is Wyoming at 33.7, where the lowest adoption overall in the country is Massachusetts at 6.3. Our national per capita adoption, so that's looking at adoptions per every 1,000 people, averages about 13. So here's examples of the dashboards that we have. You can see both the per capita data that we just shared and also the aggregates for state totals for how many animals are coming in and leaving shelters. And you can also sort that by different years. You can look at cats versus dogs, shelters versus rescues, so that you can see where your organization compares to other organizations in the state, and then also compared to other states in the country. So looking at dogs specifically, in 2024, we had 2 million dogs that had an adoption outcome. You can see this is the trend line looking at 2019 before the pandemic compared to last year, compared to the year prior in 2023. That top line is the pre-pandemic high of dog adoption. So it's looking at the number of dogs that were adopted during that 12-month span. You can see both that we had more adoptions every month, no surprise. Now in 2025, that adoptions have been lower than the pandemic, but you can also see there's a lot more seasonality in 2019 before the pandemic than there has been the past 2 years. Dog adoptions have essentially flatlined the last 2 years with little tiny spikes in March and August. In March, we know is PetSmart, one of their big national adoption events. And then August is Clear the Shelters. So we are seeing even those big national initiatives have less of an impact on adoptions for dogs than they once did, which goes to a lot of the other data that we'll be sharing as to why and what some of the things that we can do differently. This is looking at all things being the same, taking the pandemic out of it, and we're still seeing the number of dogs being adopted decrease. So we're down 1% compared to compared to 2023, and we're down 13% compared to 2019. So then when we look at the medium length of stay, so our shelter's feeling full, part of that is fewer adoptions. In a lot of cases, it's also fewer intakes, but we are still feeling full even when there are fewer intakes. And a lot of that is being driven by the length of stay. And so we wanted to look at that for dogs and look at it by size. And we can see that again this year, this is now the third year that we've looked at this, compared to 2019, we are seeing increases in length of stay for all dog sizes, nearly double in most cases. So even the small fluffy dogs are experiencing a longer length of stay than they were prior to the pandemic. At the same time, we have 2.2 million cats that were adopted in 24. So that's 200,000 more cats than dogs. And their seasonal trends are following actually higher than they were in 2019. So we see that both the seasonality is maintained in the last couple of years compared to pre-pandemic, and we're seeing that the number of cats being adopted is more than it was prior to the pandemic. So very opposite experience for dogs. So we're up 2% compared to 2023, and we're up 3% compared to 2019. And you can see also why a lot of shelters don't have a lot of cats in their care compared to dogs, which is a very different experience than we had in 2019. We're looking at this as actually compared to the year prior. We are seeing that the length of stay for cats of all ages is continuing to decrease, with the highest length of stay, of course, is our senior cats from the time that they come in until the time they're adopted. But also our juveniles are at 11 days on average, or median, I'm sorry. And this is what it looks like overall when we lay over the cats and dogs. You can see that, again, that 2019 number for dogs is far higher, and it was really a lot higher than it was for cats in most of the months, and that gap continues to widen. So one of the reasons that animals may be staying in as a higher length of stay than before is their altered status, especially with challenges in getting animals spayed and neutered. We looked at just last year compared to the year before of the number or the rate of cats and dogs that are entering shelters, altered, unaltered, or unknown. And you can see when looking at dogs, we're seeing that unaltered dogs entering shelters is increasing, and unaltered cats entering shelters is also increasing. But when you look at that combined, it's approximately 3 out of every 4 cats and dogs that are entering shelters are entering unaltered. We also are looking at the distribution on the different organization types. So when we look at foster-based rescues in the light blue, government agencies in the orange, and then private shelters in the yellow, and private shelters with a government contract in that dark blue, we see that 48% of all of the animals entering shelters are entering through government shelters. And when we say community intakes, we're taking out transfers. So just animals that are coming in from the community are coming in predominantly into government shelters, no surprise there. But we do see a large number, really of 15% of rescues that are bringing in animals direct from the community, not just as transfers in. So then when we look at how that distribution occurs for adoption, it does seem to level out a lot more, where we're seeing about a fourth in most cases for the organization representation and adoptions. When we look at foster analysis, then we started to look at the last 24 months, so January of 2023 through December of 2024. Government orgs are on top and rescues are in the middle. You can see that this is the number of animals or dogs that were fostered each month. you can see that over the last 24 months, the number of dogs that are fostered in rescues, foster-based rescues, which would be their total animals in care in most cases, continues to go down. The private organizations on the bottom pretty much is flat. And government organizations are really making up for that gap with the number of dogs that are in foster care. So then when we look at median length of stay to adoption, so all of the animals or that are the dogs that are coming in to shelters from the time they enter until the time that they're adopted, when we look at that by age, we can see, so before we had looked at it by size, and now that we're looking at by age, we can see again, the distribution between the length of stay for owner surrenders versus the length of stay for strays. Of course, we know that some of the increase for the stray length of stay is for their mandated stray hold time. Unfortunately, there's not a national average, so we're not able to see how much time should be deducted from that. But you can see that it's probably pretty close that if we were to figure 3 to 5 days that animals are being held for stray time, that there really isn't a disadvantage for how they enter the shelter, whether stray or owner surrender, that impacts their length of stay. And that's across all of the ages. Looking at it by size is a relatively similar experience, except for the gap starts to widen as we get to medium-sized dogs, and then even more when we get to large-sized dogs, which would indicate that large dogs who enter as a stray have a higher rate of or a higher median income or median length of stay to adoption, which makes them more at risk too in the shelter as they're staying longer and filling cages up longer and longer. Oops. Okay, so now we're going to do a poll and look at weekly adoption hours. And this data comes from Shelter Love. If you add up all of the hours that you are open for adoption at your organization and select the range that applies to you, we'll share the results in a minute. But we asked Shelter Love to do some analysis with us on this project and help identify where our average number of annual adoptions are falling into the adoption hours. So Tori, I'll let you share the results whenever you think you get enough results. But we started to look originally at 29 and under weekly hours, and we ended up cutting that off at one point because it was so low for the number of adoptions that we really, for Expo presentation, didn't think a lot of organizations would be open those few hours. And we found that to be very true, that a lot of organizations were open that few of hours. But you can see as we look here, the highest number of organizations in this sample were actually open between 30 to 35 hours. And that's roughly the lowest of this range of adoptions that occurred during that time. Where on the inverse, the lowest number of organizations were represented with that 65 to 70 open hours a week. And it looks like that trend is represented here too. So you can see that the organizations that are open 30 to 45 hours are pretty flatline on the average number of adoptions that they're doing each year. Once they hit that 46 to 50, there's a huge jump. It's about 50%. Then that pretty much flatlines, but it does continue to increase until you get to 66. And then there's about another 30% increase in the adoptions that are occurring within the year, which could indicate that simply shifting your adoption hours or even adding to could make a big difference in getting animals home. The one that had the most hours was Humane Society of Utah. They are open from 11 to 7 Sunday through Friday, and then they open actually an hour earlier on Saturdays. And they shared too that they continue to grow their adoption hours post-COVID and continue to see more and more people show up to adopt as they expand their hours. And Sundays are now their second busiest day, second to Saturday, than previous, which was a new addition for them as well. We also saw in this data set that 55% of adoptions occur between 5 and 8 p.m. And as we've polled people with this data, a lot of organizations are closing before or at 5 p.m., maybe 6 p.m. And so we're likely missing a big subset of people who would adopt if they could get to your organization before or between 6 and 8 p.m. We're also seeing that the highest occurrence of adoptions is actually in November and December, so which would indicate both some opportunities for adoption events, since people are still wanting to adopt and are doing it at the highest rate in November and December, versus where a lot of our adoption events are geared towards spring and summer, since that's when we feel busy and full. But if we were to actually have adoption events and clear the shelters prior to us getting busy, it could have a really positive impact on our capacity. And with that, I'll turn it over to April.
All righty. Hello, everyone. I'm just fascinated by this adoption hours data that's coming out. And at AdoptPet, we're also looking at some adoption hours as well. So we'll release that data as soon as we've done our analysis on our end as well. So I think there's a bunch of us coming together to try to understand that. But what I want to talk about today is how we're getting adopter interest, because before they come into your building for your hours, they have to find your organization, actually find the pet. Next slide. So in order for online adoption to, in order for people to actually find your website and find animals, these three things, I love a good Venn diagram, have to happen. And so this is that when somebody searches online, they're going to be able to find a pet that they're looking for. They can meet the pet and then take it home. And one of the interesting things about online adoption or just business in general is that the vast majority of people actually search online before they ever go into a place of business. So your presence online is really, really important. There's a bunch of different levers you can pull. I don't have time to get into all of these, but you definitely want to understand SEO and your website and social media, the completeness of your pet profiles, your adoption process, your responsiveness, all of these play a role. But I'm going to talk mostly today about your pet profiles because that's what AdoptPet is doing with your organization's data. But before we get into those pet profiles, I did want to give some updates on what is happening in the world of Google Trends. Next slide. I pulled this data through yesterday, so I wanted to see if there's been any changes in 2025 since I last pulled the data. So this is taking all of the searches that are done through Google with these search terms of dogs for sale, buy a dog, adopt a dog, and dogs for adoption, and looking at them and comparing them to each other to see how those trends are playing out. I, of course, always go all the way back to 2004 at this point, just so we can see since the beginning of Google Trends, what's going on. And actually, what's interesting is that the adoptions are pretty much the searches related to dog adoption are flat for the past 3 years. Um, and dogs for sale is at an all-time low. And this really just helps us understand why we're all feeling like there's less interest in dogs, because people are searching less, even when it comes to dogs for sale. That's lower than it's ever been when we look at the searches that are being done online. So it makes sense why we're feeling like there's less interest in dogs. Next slide. When we look at puppies, really most people don't search for buy a puppy, adopt a puppy, or puppies for adoption. They are searching puppies for sale. But what we are seeing is that even puppies for sale has gone real stagnant and has gone back to the numbers and searches that were done way back in 2004, which also tells us that there's just less interest in dog acquisition at this time. But really, when you're looking at Google Trends, if you're going to do this on your own, really the only search term related to puppies that gets any search traffic at all is puppies for sale. And this is why all those breeder and broker sites do really, really well on Google search. And that's why they show up at the top, because they're paying to make sure that they show up when people search puppies for sale. And your shelter is likely not showing up when people search puppies for sale. Next slide. So we can't not look at cats too, but cats are just having their moment. Even when we look at the data, nothing's really changing here. They're continuing to have a lot of interest. People are searching cats for adoption. People really don't search cats for sale very much. It is really adoption is the point of acquisition where they find a stray or things like that. And then the next slide. is just looking at the update when we look at for sale, and comparing dogs, puppies, cats, and kittens. And what you see here is that puppies for sale is really the only for sale search term that people in general use when they're looking to acquire. Next slide. So I'm going to get into complete profiles. If you've seen any presentations I've given, I kind of usually go through these fairly quickly, but I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this because we have been doing a ton of research around the perfect profile, basically. And the latest research that we did, the general public, we used to think of profiles as being more rich or more complete when they have more information, like they have more photos, they have personality traits, they have all this information. But in the latest qualitative and quantitative research we did, we actually, the general public considers it like mandatory. They actually consider it incomplete if it doesn't have all of the things I'm going to talk about, which is interesting when you look at like our different perspectives, because we think we're always adding more to the profile to make them better when the general public actually has this expectation of all these things are going to be included in the profile when I'm looking to adopt a pet and look at their profile online. So as far as the initial photo, this is the most critical thing you can have on a pet's profile because it is what is getting people to click on that profile online. Even if you have a bunch of other information, if you don't have the photo, they can't envision the pet, they're not going to click on it. And this is just some examples of why the photo matters on Adopt a Pet, but also on your website. So if there's no photo and it shows up in search results against pets that have photos, people are going to click on the pet that has a photo. Adopt a Pet has something called a new pet alert, where we send out an email to people every time a new pet is added in their area. And if it doesn't have a photo, then that pet's definitely not getting clicked on in that email. We did pull our stats around this. So that photo increases engagement by 500%. I'm not sure why it's not 1,000,000%, because we just know that if you don't have a photo on your pet, it is rarely, if ever, getting clicked on. And likely only the ones that are getting clicked on are high demand breeds, where people are looking for a French bulldog puppy and it gets listed without a photo and they're going to click on it because that's what they've been looking for. So the photo is really, really critical. And if you think about it, nobody clicks on a Facebook post without a photo. Nobody clicks on an Instagram story or reel without a photo or a video. So this is absolutely mandatory. You need to have a photo. Next slide. So health status, when we asked users to force rank what's most important to them in a profile, it was the initial photo, and number 2 was health status, which is really interesting because in general, we don't talk about health status indicators a lot. We all know spay, neuter, and vaccine, dates as being health status. And then we have like the Asilomar Accords. But here's what people really want when we ask them to explain what they're looking for in health status. So they really want to know the cost of care, because the cost of care has gone up substantially, specifically on large dogs over the past decade. People want to know what the cost of care is going to be. So when you're adding health status indicators into your stories, you want to be specific. If you can estimate cost of care by month, that is really, really helpful, especially if they're on a therapeutic diet. Details if you're covering any cost of care, not only post adoption, but if you're going to continue, for instance, if the cat is diabetic and you're going to continue to provide the insulin, you want to include that in the story. Dentals come up a lot, probably because dentals can be expensive. And so if you can include when the pet last had a dental or if they are going to need a dental in the future, so people know what to expect there. And then anything you can include around heartworm tests and any heartworm preventative. So when was the last preventative? When is the next preventative needed? Are you going to include 3 months of preventative, et cetera? And then when are the next vaccines going to be due? Because in general, the public understands that almost every pet they're adopting from a shelter or rescue organization is going to be current on vaccines at that time, but maybe the vaccine is going to be due in a year. And if it's a young animal, it could mean that the vaccine is going to be due in a couple of weeks, and you're going to cover that as an organization. So you want to include that as well. The things you don't want to do is to be extremely vague, which causes the potential adopter to question why you're being vague. They know you're being vague. Omit completely so that when they show up, then you're launching into here all the medical issues that this animal has, especially if it's very medically complex. And then the other thing is just consider whether or not you need to require an experienced adopter, especially for some of these a bit more like low maintenance medical things where you're going to be providing a lot of support. If you do include needs an experienced adopter in their profile, it may eliminate them from a lot of searches. And then here's just an example of, this one says that this dog has a stage 1 heart murmur that requires no additional medical care. You could include that most dogs at 12 years old probably have a stage 1 heart murmur, or you could even link out to your website if you've got some articles or information about stage 1 heart murmur so people get an understanding of what that is. Next slide. So personality traits, these have been around in some shelter software has them, some doesn't, but AdoptPet did a bunch of research here around personality traits. This is the third most asked for thing from potential adopters. So we did the research and came up with 20 that people understand because you can really go wild with personality traits and descriptors. So we do have a list of 20 that we did the research on. We're happy to provide those to everyone. But you really want to make sure that you are maintaining a list, that you're not asking staff and volunteers and fosters to come up with their own personality traits. Just provide a list that they can choose from, because it eliminates that need to come up with a great descriptor. We recommend that you include 3 on every profile, just to give some idea of what the personality is going to be like. You can, of course, include more, but we would say that the minimum is 3. And then make adding personality traits to your pet's story or to AdoptPet part of your operations. So when somebody takes a pet out to get a new photo, just make sure that they're also adding personality traits as well. Fosters, make sure you're following up and asking them to add personality traits. Because the big don't here is when you don't include them. So personality traits will increase interest, both applications and inquiries by 4x. So it seems so simple and straightforward, yet it's not done on most animals. So you really, really should include personality traits. If you would like a list of our personality traits, I will grab a link after I head off to the next presenter and put it into the chat so everyone can actually look at the link of our 20 personality traits. Next slide. Oh, actually go back one slide real quick. Sorry. Okay, we're going to do a quick poll. Actually, I forgot. We're going to talk about adoption fees. And we're going to do a quick poll on when do you use $0 adoption fees in your organizations? And please select all that apply. So do you use a $0 adoption fee for an event on all of your pets, maybe all of your cats or all of your dogs or all of your senior dogs, or on select pets where this pet's been with you for a really long time, so you're going to reduce the adoption fee? So I want everyone to take just a few seconds to answer this. Make sure you check all that apply, because we just did some research on adoption fees and we have some data we're going to be sharing that will be interesting. Okay, great. Next slide. So what we see on the results here is that 63% of you do use these for events, 74% of you are using on select pets, and 18% on all pets. So we did some research around $0 adoption fees. Around adoption fees in general, we have this research available. If you would like it, you can email. I'll share my email at the end of this as well in the chat, so you can email me. We'll send you all of our data on adoption fees. But we asked the question around what is too much, and the great news here is that as long as you're charging less than $300, people seem to be pretty open to the adoption fee, especially if you include what they're getting in that adoption fee and what the value is. So if every pet you adopt out is $200, but you're including spay and neuter, vaccines, microchips, all of those things, and those are valued at $1,000, people in general are very open to up to $300, whether it's dogs or cats. We also asked around the sentiment of $0 adoption fees, and the general public said that they're open to $0 adoption fees, but what came up loud and clear about $0 adoption fees is that they understand when you're having an event like Clear the Shelters, or some kind of large adoption events. But when you are using $0 adoption fees on specific animals, they do believe something's wrong with that animal, and that's why it's a $0 adoption fee. Now, it may be that that animal is more challenging to place, and that's why you've reduced the adoption fee down. But just know that if they see a $0 adoption fee and they don't see it associated with an event, they do go to that negative, something's wrong with the pet. Now, here's where we can get into human behavior and psychology. There's a difference between waiving an adoption fee, having a free pet, and sponsored adoption fees. So I do recommend that you consider totally changing the word you use around your $0 adoption fees and calling them sponsored. This doesn't have to mean that somebody in the public is sponsoring your fees. You are sponsoring the fee if you are waiving it, right? You're covering that adoption fee. So don't be afraid to say that you're sponsoring the adoption fee. But I would just say to be really, really thoughtful about $0 adoption fees. You may even want to run an assessment internally to see like what happens if you actually raise the adoption fee to $25 and never have zero. But people in general do assume something's wrong with the pet if you do not have agency-wide $0 adoption fees. If you have a really complex structure, make sure you put that in the story. We have the ability for you to add your adoption fees at the shelter level, so they show up on every single pet automatically, or you can go in individually. And the last comment I'll make about photos is we did release a bunch of photo research as well. There is an expectation that you will have 4 to 7 photos on every single pet that's available for adoption. This is from the general public. We also asked, what about if there's a video? And even with a video, they still want 2 photos. So minimum is 2 photos per profile that you really want to get, but you really want to get 4. And we have this formula. We now know that they want that portrait as their first photo. Second photo should be full body. Third photo should show some kind of personality trait. And fourth photo, if you can get it, should show that they're good with other pets or kids. So if you can show a cat that's with a dog, then they know there's visual proof that they have lived with other dogs, or you can show a dog with a cat or a dog with another dog. And we know that having 4 photos increases applications and inquiry 3 times compared to having 1 photo. So it's worth the investment to get those 4 photos because they are going to increase interest. And then the final slide I have here is just related to your adoption process. So the more clarity you can provide on your process, the better. It just sets up some expectations on how long it's going to take you to respond. Every time somebody submits an inquiry on a pet at Adopt a Pet, we do follow up and ask them if they adopted. And this is what we get back. So 42% adopted a different pet, which is great. 38% never heard back. So that's why they didn't adopt, and 13% didn't know where to go. So make sure you have your address up to date, your hours of operation. I've talked a lot about how I couldn't even find hours of operation on some websites when I've done audits. And then be really clear on how long is it going to take for you to respond to their inquiries or their applications. If it's 24 to 48 hours, if it's 5 days, just be really clear so that they know when they can expect to hear back and know if they should consider looking for a different pet. That's all for me.
Great. Thanks, April. Hi, everyone. I am Courtney Suthoff from Hills, and I'm going to talk a little bit deeper about the adopter perspectives around adoption, around fostering, both in terms of the barriers and the opportunities directly from the adopters themselves. So a couple of years ago, we set out to really understand not just what was happening. So the SAC data, tells us, adoptions are flat or down, or cats, are increasing, large dogs are staying longer. And outside of some of the kind of the macroeconomic trends, which we all know, housing restrictions and things like that, but we really wanted to dig deeper into kind of the adopter psyche to understand really what are the top barriers, what are the tipping points that help move them, to conversion within the adoption environment, and how we can just kind of help optimize using data really as our guide. So that is the State of Shelter Pet Adoption Report. I'm going to talk through the current report, which you can find on hillspet.com/shelter. And then very soon, in just a few months, we'll be releasing our new report. And the data there's some areas that are similar, but there's some areas that are quite different, some declines in key areas. So we're excited for you to see that in the coming months. So go ahead and flip to the next slide. So we'll start with kind of the good news. When we asked a general population study. So this were 2,000 plus adopters or consumers that either had adopted or were considering adoption. So we asked them a series of questions, and so to start, we asked them, whether or not they are likely to adopt a shelter pet as their next animal that they're bringing into their household. And so we saw that 66% of them, said yes. It's still top of mind. It's still, where they would like to kind of acquire or source the next pet into their household. So that is good news. I'm going to go to the next slide. And I think one of the other, kind of the other pieces of this is once they get in the door, if they had a good experience, it really sets the kind of the trajectory is in terms of whether or not they're going to come back and adopt, when they are adding a second pet or replacing a pet who may have passed. And so when kind of asked specifically about the impact of shelters and the professionals that work within the shelter space, 90% of the people who had adopted reported that they had a positive experience during that adoption experience, which is great news. And then of the people that animal shelters, of people, 71% of people, need more caffeine this afternoon, but 71% of people agree that animal shelters do everything possible to ensure pets that are available are healthy or well-trained or going to be able to seamlessly integrate into those new homes post-adoption. So that also very good news. I'm going to go to the next slide. And then one of the areas that I think we're kind of all very interested in understanding is who is interested in adopting what type of pet, right? And so I think Gen Z and millennial probably is a little bit of a buzzword. I think we all use it pretty pretty frequently now. But when we looked kind of across the population segmentations, and we looked at who was most likely to adopt, and within our report itself, you can dig a lot deeper too in terms of who's most likely to adopt a small dog or an older dog. But when we looked kind of across the Gen Pop, you see a higher likelihood of adoption for millennials, followed by Gen Z, and then even Gen X. And so really what that tells us is not that we shouldn't look holistically across kind of the adopter segmentation base, but as we're thinking about campaigns or targeting or messaging or how we incentivize different age groups to come in. This is really helpful for us in knowing who's most likely to say yes to adoption. Then we can go to the next slide. So no surprise, obviously we're seeing, year over year cat adoptions continuing to increase, which is great for cats and obviously kind of maybe at the expense of dogs. But we also wanted to understand a little bit more about why are cats having a moment, as we often kind of say or joke. And I think the research and the feedback from the adopters themselves were that cats are perceived to be easier to own than dogs. And that is kind of across a lot of different spectrums. So if you think about, especially Gen Z and millennials moving to more urbanized, cities, it's easier to have a cat in an apartment. There's also this belief that cats require less maintenance, which in some ways is good, right? Because it's getting them to say yes to cats, at a higher rate. But then we also know that less than half of cats are seeing the vet on a regular basis. And so, when you bring a cat into your household and it's not receiving proper vet care, obviously over, years of how, however long that adopter has that pet, it could lead to health issues, which could lead to relinquishment in the future if it's urinating outside of the litter box or, needing something more advanced to solve some of the problems that cats experience as they age. So again, it's also just setting the proper expectations with adopters that yes, cats are smaller and they don't eat as much, but they do still need veterinary care and those sorts of things. We also wanted to understand, own a large breed, why, what are the challenges? So kind of no surprise that the top responses were that it's difficult to travel with a large dog. It's difficult, if housing restrictions make it difficult, really for mid to large size animals. So that kind of came into play here. And that large dog just take up too much space. So whether that's when the home itself or needing a backyard for proper exercise and enrichment. So some of these are going to be easier to solve than others, but it continues to be, I think, a challenge we see for large dogs, especially in the housing environment, where it is becoming harder and harder to be able to kind of bring large dogs in, especially into rental environments where we see more and more Gen Z and millennial in particular moving. So just some things to be aware of. Go to the next slide. Now the good news, or the interesting thing, or probably one of the things we found most interesting, was when we were digging into large dog, who was most likely to adopt large dogs, and overwhelmingly the greatest population was Gen Z, and then followed by millennial. And what that tells us, especially when you look at just Gen Z trends in general, they're moving to different parts, very specific parts of the country. So if you're in what we would consider a Gen Z hotspot, so think Charlotte or Austin, Denver, et cetera, kind of some of those markets, those Gen Zers in those markets are the ones who are more than likely going to be the ones to come in and welcome those large dogs. And it's not to say that in other markets, like in New York City or Chicago, that there's not, but there are greater barriers to overcome, even with the demographics and the audience segmentation that are most likely to adopt. But this audience, if you're trying to move large dogs, is really the one to target and try to bring into your shelter environment, to try to get that conversion and to move the dogs into these homes that are more likely to adopt them. So when we looked at at barriers, again, no surprise, but important to kind of understand and acknowledge, cost is the number one barrier to adoption. If we want to go to the next slide, we did kind of dig deeper. So beyond just cost, vet care, is really kind of continues to be a top concern. 84% of the respondents in our study said that vet care is the most expensive part of ownership. And then it was followed by, things like nutrition, training, grooming, et cetera. But vet care in particular, continues to be one of the primary reasons that people are not saying yes to adopting or not bringing a secondary pet, because they're worried about, what those financial implications could be for their family or their household. Access to care also is a barrier. So not just the cost of care, but these three different dimensions. So the proximity of a pet owner to a veterinary office, the availability of reliable or pet-friendly transit to a veterinary office, and then the availability. So, I think no surprise, but it's getting harder and harder to get both preventative care visits, and then in states of emergency, even to get into an emergency clinic can be quite challenging depending on the market. So these are things that people are thinking about, which is good, but it's also, a pretty significant barrier to them saying yes, because they're worried about, any of these different dimensions, from cost to access to care. And then, we also looked at it, from not just the kind of the audience demographic, but also we looked at income levels and kind of what the threshold and the tipping points were. And so, if a person makes less than $75,000 a year, they are significantly less likely to even consider adopting a pet. We are seeing both in this study, but especially in our new study, and I think we've seen some other pet ownership demographic studies, that there's still a desire to have a pet. And so instead of purchasing from a breeder or adopting from a shelter, we are continuing to see this increase in acquiring in other ways. So in particular from a family or a friend. So I just note that to say it's an important watch out, that, acquisition is still happening, and pet ownership obviously should not be a privilege. Everybody should have the opportunity to own a pet, but we are seeing from the data that acquisition is still happening, but happening in other ways, and unfortunately moving away from some of the opportunities within shelter and rescue. I'm going to go to the next slide. I kind of talked about this, so I won't spend much time here. But the income levels obviously impact the type of housing that specific potential pet owners are able to afford. And so 56% of pet owners that are making less than $50,000 a year are more likely to face pretty restrictive housing barriers to becoming pet owners. And so again, when we think about the markets where you have younger audiences who really do want to be pet owners, this is going to continue to be a significant barrier for them to be able to overcome. The next slide. Um, and not to be the Debbie Downer, but there are more barriers. So the other, once we got past the kind of the portion of the respondents who, were worried about cost or worried about access to care or worried about housing restrictions, then there was another subset of that audience who had the means, had the accessibility through, through their housing, but there are other barriers that are holding them back. And a lot of these, I think, are a lot more attainable to be able to really impact and to perhaps convert. So, there was about 20% of the population that were looking for something very specific, probably a breed specific, that they felt, and again, kind of from an awareness perspective, that they felt they couldn't find in a shelter. There's another population here, about 15%, again, from an awareness perspective, felt like they didn't have shelters nearby, which always surprises me because, Google and AI are our friends. It's very easy to find this information, but it just points towards a lack of awareness, especially with the resources and the pets that are so easily accessible, very close to them that they just may not know exist. And then there's these perceived barriers around pets that are coming from shelters have behavioral issues, or pets that are coming from shelters have health concerns. April talked about perhaps what we're signaling when we're offering $0 adoptions, which I just found her data very fascinating. But it is signaling potentially that there's a health issue, there's a behavior issue. That's why a pet is being discounted, and our data kind of showed it too. That these are potential barriers, and it's more from a perception than it is from a reality in a lot of cases. But this slide, I think, overall just speaks to awareness barriers that we might have to do more myth busting or education to ensure that people are not just automatically writing off these different types of pets or shelters and rescues for acquisition because they just aren't aware of what's available. Last thing on awareness is that we are seeing almost the majority of people are interested in fostering, but less than half of them know how to get started. So, again, it just kind of points to this knowledge gap and is a big opportunity to be able to flip the script and kind of really invest, whether it's through social or through email campaigns, but helping people understand how easy it is to say yes to foster or to come into a shelter to see the phenomenal animals that are available, or even just going online to the to your adoption pages to kind of help them with that awareness gap that we're seeing through the data. And then a couple of things, just as we think about kind of as the pet owners or the prospective adopters are moving through the journey, we've found that adoption is first tied to feelings of happiness, but then very quickly are followed by less positive emotions, and anxiety is one of those. And then when we ask, well, what made you anxious? Behavior once they brought a pet into their home was the top concern. And so, it's just something to be aware of, and obviously no surprise that, when pets are going from one environment to a new environment, it can be quite stressful, but it can also lead to this very quick pivot from this euphoria and happiness of bringing this new pet into their household to stress and anxiety that potentially could cause them to consider, bringing a pet back or, at least seeking, incremental post-adoption support. We're going to go to the next slide. The good news, though, so when we asked the consumers in our study, what would help ensure that they did not actually bring that pet back and relinquish it back to the shelter. And the power of post-adoption support was really the number one thing. So 94% of pet owners who had thought about it said that if a shelter offered or if they received support, they ultimately ended up keeping that pet. And so I think this just speaks again to the power of post-adoption support, whether that is, offered through a telehealth or through on-site support or even email and check-ins that are automated. Any of these touch points really help kind of ease that anxiety, especially for first-time pet owners who haven't seen, kind of the evolution of, after a pet is in a home for a few weeks and a few months, how it decompresses and things do start to feel more routine. So just kind of underscoring the importance of that post-adoption support. And then I'll end on some good news. The majority of the folks who we spoke to agree that the shelter staff and or the adoption counselors help them set realistic expectations about they would experience, when they brought that pet home. Within the deeper study, you can go and see there are 3 different dimensions of those expectation setting. And when an adoption counselor did all 3, even if it was a challenging acclimation, the overall adopter or the adopter overall had a greater satisfaction of the experience. And again, leads to higher retention rates. It leads to a better overall experience, and ultimately it leads to better outcomes and hopefully that repeat adoption, kind of down the road. So just kudos to everybody. We know it is a hard job managing a lot of different stakeholders and different things within the environment, but you really are the ones who are making the difference, and it's nice to see the data support that as well. All right, and then I think I turn it over to Amanda.
Yes, thank you, Courtney. So I just want to take a moment here to pause because I know that we're throwing a lot of information at you all. I'm Amanda Foster. I'm the Director of Programs at Human Animal Support Services, a project of Austin Pets Alive. And I'm really excited to be here to add our piece of the puzzle to this conversation today. So just going to pause for a second, back up, and kind of take stock of what we've been looking at so far with shelter animals count, telling us about the trends that we're seeing with Adopt a Pet, and really talking about like how we can get more people into our shelters, and Hill's giving us some insight into perceptions of adopters. And where we fit into this conversation is we wanted to know once you've done all those things, right? You have your website up to date, you have people coming in, you understand the perceptions of the people that are wanting to adopt. How do we make sure that they're actually adopting once they're actually physically in our location? So that's what I'm going to be talking to you all about today. And so last year we got to partner with PetSmart Charities to launch this really exciting initiative that we called Competitive Pet Placement Project, to take a look at some shelters and say, okay, so we've got the people in our building. Are they actually leaving with a pet or not? And go to the next slide. So we went to these 5 organizations and we set up some data tracking and worked with staff on the ground. I like to share this slide just because I'm really proud that this project got to have such a reach across some different types of organizations, some different geographic locations, different mission types, different sizes of organizations. And so it gave us a really great case study and sample to kind of take a look on the inside of our processes in-house. Next slide. And one of the main initiatives of this project was to set up foot traffic data tracking. And we had 2 goals with this project. We wanted to know how often are the people that are coming into the shelters interested in actually adopting versus not adopting. And if someone came in with the intention to adopt and didn't leave with a pet, why was that happening? And this picture on the side here is an example of one of the processes we set up, where people could scan a QR code to get into a queue and start working with the shelter staff immediately, with shelter staff already knowing what that person was there for. And so something I'm going to talk about is adoption conversion rates. This is really important. I see in the chat someone wants to know my org name. We're Human Animal Support Services, a project of Austin Pets Alive. And so adoption conversion rate is looking at how many people are actually leaving with a pet when they come in interested in a pet. And next slide. So what this looked like was we set up a QR code so that people could sign in and indicate what they were interested in when they showed up. And then staff would answer some questions at the end of the client visit to get some information on answering those two questions from the top, which is if somebody comes in with the intention to adopt, do they actually leave with a pet? Yes or no? And if no, why not? We set up this through dashboard monitoring, spreadsheets, and a QR code, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. If this is something you're interested in doing, it can be as simple as a clicker when people come in, or just pencil and paper, but there are technology solutions out there too, such as Waitwhile and using Google Sheets. So I'd like to ask everybody in the audience to put in the chat, what do you think the percentage of potential adopters entering shelters are that were actually leaving with a pet? And if you've seen this presentation before, don't cheat, but if you don't know the answer, give me your guess. So 10%, 15, 28, 35, 13, 35. Okay, we're all over the board. Oh, somebody said 60. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So what we found was that on average, it was 1 in 3 people. So 31% of people were actually leaving with a pet when they came in intending to adopt, which means that we're missing a big chunk of people. This also really varied by organization. Sometimes we were seeing as low as 8% of people leaving with a pet and as high as 51%. And this indicates a really big missed opportunity when we're talking about how we want to increase adoptions out of shelters. And so we did the math. So just in 6 months at these 5 locations, if everyone who wanted to adopt a pet had actually left with 1 pet, it would have been over 11,000 animals, when in reality, we only had less than 4,000 pets leaving the shelter the same day. So that was a missed opportunity of over 7,000 pets just from this small sample size. So that's a huge opportunity to empty our kennels if we were able to increase that conversion rate. And then we dug into why. From the public's perspective, when they're coming in and they want to adopt and then they leave without a pet, what do you all think was the #1 reason why? Wait times, size of the pet, the adoption process, didn't have what they wanted, it's a bad fit, they changed their minds, not enough info. Ooh, too many to choose from. Decision fatigue. Okay, let's see what we actually found. So staff reported that the top reason for not leaving with a pet after they worked with a client was that the pet isn't ready to leave. And that one is really interesting because that's us. That's us as organizations creating bottlenecks in our system where somebody's seeing a pet that they're really interested in, but we're saying, oh, you can't leave with that pet yet. And so that was really eye-opening when we're thinking about internal barriers to getting pets out of the shelter. And I'll dig into some of these in the coming slides. So the pet isn't ready to leave. That #1 reasons this might be that the pet is unavailable for adoption because they're on some type of hold. And so the action behind this is to assess your holds. Can a pet that is placed on a medical, behavior, or other type of hold, are they eligible to actually go into a home? Does it really have to be us for each of those pets handling that pet, or are we able to send them out on like a foster to adopt or sleep over with the person that's interested in them? #2 was that they were still making a decision, and the action behind this is to offer trial adoptions. foster to adopt, day trips, sleepovers, things like that. We know that from other research that's out there, like Dr. Gunter's research and others, that if we send a dog out on a day trip, they're 5 times more likely to be adopted. We also know that dogs going out on sleepovers are 14% more likely to be adopted. And we also know that 90% of first-time fosters actually end up adopting. And so all of this is painting a picture that we need to let people do a trial run of a pet. So if you've got somebody who's kind of on the fence, we could just say, go ahead and take this pet in a sleepover, get to know them. More often than not, it's going to end in an adoption. And then additionally, adding a follow-up process. So if you have somebody who's coming in and they're not quite ready to commit, setting up a non-adoption follow-up process the next day to have a conversation with the people that we're visiting and see if they have any more questions or might still be interested. Number 3 was that they didn't have what they wanted, which I know is something that somebody guessed in the chat. And this could be species, breed, size, age, or any other number of factors. And so we'd recommend capturing a list of people who are looking for a specific type of pet and create an adopter on deck list so that if somebody is coming in because they really want a bulldog and that is absolutely what they want, the next time you have that pet that meets those requirements come in, you have somebody to call immediately so that pet doesn't have to sit in your kennel and can fast track them out. This is also, go back one. This is also a really good indication that we need to have more conversations with people, because are they really interested in a German Shepherd, or are they looking for a specific characteristic and personality type that we might actually have in our kennels? And if we have a deeper conversation around why they're looking for a specific species, breed, size, age, maybe we find that we do actually have a good match for them that they could consider. And next. And then we have this big other category. We found that there were just a lot of other stuff that was going on that were creating barriers around adoption, and things that were falling into this category were things like wait times, the process was taking too long, the pet that the person was interested in was already adopted or sent to foster. So maybe they saw that pet online and then when they showed up, it wasn't there. Sometimes people just weren't at the right location. We found that was happening quite a bit with organizations that had multiple locations and not keeping that location up to date. So they show up at one side of the town to adopt a pet and then find out that they need to go to the other side. And we just hope that they got there. And then we also found quite often that people were leaving without ever being spoken to. And that falls into some of that client support, communication, better customer service that we're going to talk about in a little bit here. And what we also found was that the average wait time was about an hour. So when somebody said that wait times were too long, an hour was on average how long they were waiting. So when you're looking at the flow of your foot traffic and your processes, we really need to be keeping that below an hour so that we don't lose people in our process. We saw a huge range in this. We saw some people waiting even as long as 3 or more hours just to be spoken to. So this isn't the time to go through the whole process. This is just the time from when I walk in the door to when I actually get to speak to a staff member. And next. And then another big takeaway is to make the most of the first visit. We found that non-adopters returned only 17% of the time, and that they were less likely to adopt than the average. So that means that when we might only get one chance to get that pet into a home when somebody comes in. And if you're interested in information about the other reasons, we do have a full presentation on this on our website that you can check out. All right, next. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what we're doing right now. So as an extension of our competitive pet placement project last year, we're working this year with SBCAI on what we're calling our modern adoption process. And this is really focused on customer service so that we can try to get to the root of how do we move pets through an animal shelter by by offering better customer service that is more closely related to like what you might see in sales and retail settings where we're converting a lot of people to taking home what they come in for. And we have a free online course that's coming up this summer that we are really excited to be talking more about in July. So stay tuned for that. And next. And some preliminary findings. So this is all being captured right now. So we're continuing our foot traffic data analysis as a part of this project. And some of the key things that we're seeing so far is that the busiest days of the week aren't always what you might think. When we go and start this project, we typically see that shelters are saying that they're expecting that the weekend is going to be the busiest day of the week. But when we actually start to collect data, we're seeing that that's not always the case. For example, Maui and APA, Austin Pets Alive, is also doing their own version of this. They're both seeing that there's actually weekdays where where they're seeing the most foot traffic. So what we are really excited to be able to dive into more is how operational challenges might change in order to make decisions about what day you have staff on. So at Austin Pets Alive right now, they're analyzing that data to shift around their staff and potentially change their adoption hours, which is something that is really simple to do if you start looking at your foot traffic data. And then we also are seeing some really high spikes in the adoption conversion rate after we take a look at doing some better customer service and sales tactics. We saw, for example, at Lynchburg Humane Society, they saw a 67% adoption conversion rate after we launched this training, which is way above average and really exciting. So kudos to you all if you're on the call. And that still deciding is one of the most frequent reasons that we're seeing still across this version of the project. But more to come. If you want to get started, there are some resources to get started on tracking foot traffic and breaking down barriers. But I'm now going to hand it over to Lindsay to talk about Adopters Welcome.
Hey, everyone. So I'm going to close us out with just a teaser of the Adopters Welcome program that some of you might be familiar with and others that might be brand new. I'm Lindsay Hamrick. I'm the Director of Shelter Outreach for Humane World for Animals, formerly the Humane Society of the United States. And Adopters Welcome was created over a decade ago as a way to remove barriers to adoption that tend to exist in our field, and really to build up those skills to have conversations with folks, to find out what are they interested in, how can we help them to be successful in finding a pet for adoption, and then how can we support them in the long run. Next slide, please. So we've all seen the memes on the interwebs about our reputation for having sometimes very lengthy and usually fairly intrusive application processes for folks, whether they are looking at those applications online, which is likely their first introduction to our work, or they've actually made it to your door and they're coming in and looking at what experience they might be facing as soon as they walk in. Those long paper applications or electronic applications can really discourage adopters in a couple of different ways. Number one, they're very time consuming, especially if you're an adopter who's on a site like Adopt-a-Pet and you are looking at animals that are at different organizations. And as a member of the public, you have no idea how those organizations are different from one another, what the process might look like at each one. And so folks are spending a significant amount of time filling out applications, but it also really misses an opportunity when we don't have a conversation with folks to build relationships with potential adopters, which then can lead to them disclosing the challenges that they've had in the past or the challenges that they're likely to face if they are going to move forward with adoption at this time. And then truly it can be inaccessible to some adopters if we're doing everything electronically and you have areas of your community that don't have strong internet. If you have folks who do not have English as a first language, those can all be barriers that something like a paper application can really lead to. Next slide, please. So Adopters Welcome is all about conversation. It's about having discussions with folks and having a questionnaire, or honestly, we have some shelters that have been doing the Adopters Welcome program for so long that they have nothing. So other than asking somebody for their name and how they would like to be contacted after adoption and putting that into their shelter software system, they don't even have a piece of paper anymore or a guide, because their team is so comfortable having someone just walk in the door and say, hey, what brought you here today? What are you looking for? But if you are an organization that has leaned heavily on applications, which we totally understand, and you're trying to make a shift to more conversation-based processes, it can be helpful to have a questionnaire. And in our Adopters Welcome Manual, we have a template questionnaire that you can pull. You can add your logo. You can fix it up the way that you would like to, and I'll share that link here in a minute. But a questionnaire is really about the adopter, right? It recognizes that adopters have their own wisdom, whether they've had 7 dogs over the course of their life or 14 cats, or they're brand new to pet ownership. They have some experience and relevance in bringing to the conversation that we want to be listening for. As professionals, we tend to adoption counsel from our perspective, which usually means that we are throwing a ton of information at someone. How many times have we gone through a million different behavior things? I'm a professional dog trainer, so that's usually what I lean heavily on. And I'm talking about all these weird behavior things. And at the end of the conversation, they just want to know what kind of food we fed the dog while she was in the shelter, right? So this is all about asking them what they want. There's no check marks. There's no yes, no questions. People aren't passing or failing a process that we have put in place. It is truly about meeting their needs and seeing if we have a pet that can match what they're looking for. This program also heavily empowers adoption counselors and team members to be flexible and responsive in the moment. And of course, if they need some support, that there's others on the team or managers who can help them work through something that might be a little bit sticky. And in our full training program, we walk through some of those tricky situations and give some tips. Next slide, please. So just like the rest of this webinar, we are heavy on data, and I'm just going to pull out a couple of things to consider if any of these following slides apply to your organization. Next slide. So landlord checks, they tend to come and go in our field. We often see shelters do these as part of the adoption process, and then they get away from doing it, and then they bring it back in. And often they come from a place of wanting to protect animals from having to be returned because a property owner or a landlord will decline the adoption once the person gets home. But we know from some research that when an Ohio shelter ended their strict landlord check policy, that there was no difference in pet retention and returns. And one thing that I'm really going to emphasize with data is that there is more and more national data, just like you've heard today, but you all can do your own shelter level data or rescue level data as well. So I would encourage you to look at your process and find something that you're not really sure why you still do the thing. Stop doing it for 3 or 6 months and track your own data and your own experiences in doing so. And then the second piece about landlord checks is we know that restrictive housing policies almost always discriminate against the very dogs who we are trying to put into homes. So we have looked at public housing restrictions where people cannot have a dog over 25 pounds, which is the vast majority of animals that you have in your shelters. Or the insurance companies won't allow pit bull type dogs or shepherd mixes or Rottweiler mixes or whatever they've come up with for that day. So when we assign a breed that we are guessing at when we do adoption profiles or in the adoption paperwork, we are potentially setting folks up for a lot of conflict or extra barriers when it comes to their housing policies that we don't have to. And in fact, we shouldn't be, because 90% of the time we as professionals are wrong when we are trying to guess at a dog's breed. And then the last thing that I'll say, which frankly applies to all kinds of barriers to adoption, is that when we meet people, we are only meeting them at a moment in time in their life. And so if we're doing something like landlord checks or home checks even, that is just in that very moment. And it is very likely that people are going to move, that their lifestyle is going to change, that they might have children in the future, that there may be roommates who join them or roommates who leave. I personally moved 11 times in 6 years. So if you had looked at where I lived in 2015, it would have looked very different than where I lived in 2018. And on landlord checks in particular, I want us to really use data to understand the amount of time that we are spending calling people to ask for their permission to adopt an animal to somebody who wants to adopt. And my request of all of us is, if we're going to do anything like this, that we at least use that time to talk with landlords about how their housing policies are directly impacting not just the slowing of adoptions that have happened for dogs, but also the rate of owner relinquishments that are attached to those policies. Next slide, please. And now I have to change the title of the slide. Thank you, April. So fee-waived adoption. So there have been a couple of research studies that have shown that the pets who were adopted in the spur of the moment were just as likely to still be in their home after 6 months as those adopted by owners who, quote unquote, have done lots of research. And that attachment rates to animals who were adopted during fee-waived programs were no different than those who required a fee. So we would encourage you to play with these to find ways to really increase adoptions and increase adoption awareness. If we know from the Hills data that people are really concerned about veterinary care and the cost of care, then can we remove some financial barriers through the adoption fee that they can then utilize their available funds for things for the animal in the future? Next slide. And then sort of coming off of what Amanda was saying about letting folks have time to decide, I'm a huge proponent of letting folks try out their animals. We know that an animal who comes home with you, it will be at least 6 weeks before you really know if that animal is a good fit for your family, especially if you have other resident animals or pet or children. You're really trying to figure out lots of different variables. And so if we're concerned about sending animals home with the concern that they might come back right away, I just want to reiterate Dr. Gunter's research that even a single night away from the shelter for a shelter dog reduces their cortisol level. So we can feel good about the fact that the animal got out for a couple of nights. We learned so much more. Maybe that foster parent or potential adopter took a bunch of really great photos and video that we can now use online. And so there can be a lot of perks, even if an animal ends up coming back to us. Next slide. And so these are some resources. I'll share the link in the chat on our manual. We also have an on-demand webinar series that will be up within the next month. And then we will also have a new button on that website to request an Adopters Welcome training. That should be available in the next 6 weeks or so. And we ourselves are doing additional research with the Institute for Human-Animal Connection to learn more about how Adopters Welcome impacts adoptions, impacts community engagement, and those results should be out over the next year. And with that, I'll hand it back to Stephanie.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We know we threw a lot of information at you. So please, in the coming days, take a look at our social media and also our website. We'll be emailing out our recording. And all the slides, so you'll be able to reference. And feel free to add any other questions in the chat we can capture. Otherwise, thanks for attending, and we look forward to sharing more information as we go.